Have you ever returned home to discover dozens of strangers treating your private property like a public park? That surreal moment when your peaceful sanctuary has been transformed into an unauthorized campground without your knowledge or permission. That's exactly what happened to me last summer, when the HOA president from the neighboring development decided my 15 acres of woodland would make a perfect venue for her community wilderness weekend, without bothering to ask the actual owner. Before I dive into this wild story, I'd love to know if you've ever dealt with trespassers or neighbors who didn't respect your property boundaries. Drop a comment below. I was returning a day early from a business trip to Chicago, looking forward to a quiet evening at home, before picking up my dogs from the boarding kennel the next day. As I turned onto the private road leading to my property, I noticed an unusual amount of traffic. Cars parked haphazardly along both sides of what is normally a quiet country lane. Must be some event at the new development, I thought, referring to Oak Ridge Estates, the suburban neighborhood that had sprung up adjacent to my land over the past 2 years. I'd had occasional issues with residents wandering onto my property, but nothing major. That assumption evaporated as I crested the final hill and saw my meadow, the one directly behind my house, filled with colorful tents, portable canopies, and at least 50 people milling around. For a moment I wondered if I'd somehow taken a wrong turn. But no, that was definitely my cabin in the background, my pond reflecting the afternoon sunlight, and my private property being transformed into an impromptu campground. I parked at my gate and walked toward the gathering, equal parts confused and concerned. A folding table had been set up near the tree line with a hand-painted banner reading, Oak Ridge Estates Community Wilderness Weekend. Clipboard in hand, a woman with highlighted blonde hair and designer outdoor attire that looked suspiciously unworn was directing people where to set up their equipment. "Excuse me," I said as I approached. "What's going on here?" She turned, with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to our Community Wilderness Weekend. Are you from Oak Ridge Estates? I don't recognize you." "No, I'm Jack Thornton. I own this property." The woman's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes. "Oh, you must be confused. This is the community green space that borders Oak Ridge Estates. It's designated recreational land." Blinked, momentarily speechless. "No, this is my private property. I've owned these 15 acres for over a decade." "Well, our development maps clearly show this as community wilderness access," she countered, her voice taking on a condescending tone. "I'm Karen Davidson, Oak Ridge Estates HOA president. We've been planning this event for months." "Planning? It where exactly?" "Because no one contacted me, and this is absolutely private land." I pulled out my phone, opening the property tax website to show her the parcel map. "See? This entire area is registered to me." Karen glanced at my phone with the barest pretense of interest. "Those maps are outdated. When Oak Ridge was developed, this area was designated for community use." Her dismissive attitude was starting to irritate me, especially as more cars continued to arrive, disgorging families with camping equipment who followed Karen's directions toward my pond. "How many people did you invite?" I asked, watching with growing alarm. "We have over 100 registered participants for the weekend," she replied with evident pride. "It's our first annual event, with nature hikes, campfire stories, and wilderness survival lessons. On my property without permission." I emphasized each word, trying to break through her impenetrable certainty. "It's community land," she repeated firmly, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to direct the survival instructor where to set up." As she walked away, I stood there trying to process the situation. 100 people were planning to camp on my land, led by a woman who somehow believed she had the authority to use my property, despite clear evidence to the contrary. I called after her. "You need to stop this right now. These people need to leave." Karen turned back, irritation flashing across her face. "Look, if you have concerns, you can take them up with the development office on Monday. Right now, you're disrupting an approved community event." The sheer audacity left me momentarily speechless. This wasn't just a few people accidentally wandering onto my land. This was an organized trespass on a massive scale. As I considered my options, a troubling thought occurred to me. The kennel was scheduled to drop off my 4 guard dogs. A Belgian Malinois, 2 German Shepherds and a Cane Corso at 5 p.m. These weren't family pets, but working protection dogs trained to secure my property and respond to potential threats. Having untrained strangers scattered across my land when the dogs arrived was a recipe for disaster. I needed to resolve this situation quickly before my 4-legged security team came home to find their territory filled with uninvited guests who had no idea what they were walking into. Karen's community wilderness weekend was about to encounter a wilderness reality. She clearly hadn't factored into her planning. With more campers arriving by the minute, I needed to act quickly. I approached Karen again, this time with my property deed pulled up on my phone. "Karen, this is the legal documentation showing I own this land," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "You need to stop bringing people onto my property immediately." She barely glanced at my screen. "Our development materials clearly show this area as community wilderness access. All our homeowners were promised nature trails and outdoor recreation space." She produced a glossy brochure from her clipboard. "See, right here." The brochure showed an attractive map of Oak Ridge Estates, with blue hiking trails extending well beyond the development boundaries and directly onto my property. My pond was even labeled Community Lake. "This is fraudulent," I stated, anger rising. "The developer had no right to include my land in their marketing materials. This is private property, not public recreation space." A small crowd had gathered around us, drawn by our increasingly tense conversation. "What's going on?" asked a man setting up a large tent nearby. Before I could answer, Karen jumped in. "This man is claiming he owns the community wilderness area. He's trying to ruin our weekend event." "I don't claim to own it, I do own it. I've owned this property for 15 years, I corrected. "The developer never purchased this land or secured any access rights. They simply included it in their brochures without permission." Murmurs spread through the growing audience. Some looked confused, others skeptical. A woman with 2 young children asked, "But the nature trail has been there for months. We walk it every weekend." This explained the unfamiliar paths I'd been finding cut through my woods. "Those trails were created without my knowledge or consent. This entire area is private property." Karen waved dismissively. "The developer wouldn't have included it in our community features if they didn't have proper arrangements. You're just trying to cause problems." I took a deep breath, trying another approach. "Look, I understand you were misled by the marketing materials, but there's another serious issue here. My 4 guard dogs are being returned from the kennel this afternoon. They're trained to protect this property from intruders." "Guard dogs?" A father clutching camping equipment looked alarmed. "Yes," I confirmed. "Working protection dogs, a Belgian Malinois, 2 German Shepherds and a Cane Corso. They're professionally trained, but they're specifically taught to respond to trespassers. Having strangers scattered across my land when they arrive could create a dangerous situation." This information sent a ripple of concern through the crowd, which Karen quickly tried to suppress. "He's obviously making this up to scare you," she announced loudly. "There are no guard dogs. This is public recreation land designated for Oak Ridge residents." My patience was evaporating. "I'm calling the sheriff. This is criminal trespassing. And you're putting these people at risk by misleading them." As I pulled out my phone, Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The sheriff won't side with one difficult landowner against an entire community. We have over 100 people here for an approved HOA event." "Approved by whom?" "Certainly not by the actual property owner." Her expression hardened. "The community needs this space. Your unused woods and pond are perfect for our nature programs. Be reasonable." Reasonable would have been asking permission before inviting 100 strangers onto private property. While Karen returned to directing new arrivals, I stepped away to call the sheriff's department. The dispatcher promised to send someone out, but warned it might take up to an hour due to an accident on the highway. I decided to approach some of the campers directly, hoping they might be more reasonable than their HOA president. "I'm Jack Thornton, the owner of this property," I explained to a group setting up near my pond. "There's been a misunderstanding. The developer incorrectly included my land in their amenities, but this is private property. I'm concerned about safety, especially since my guard dogs will be returning soon." Several seemed genuinely surprised. The sales office specifically highlighted these trails and the lake as community features, one woman said, looking troubled. We paid premium lot prices for wilderness access. I'm sorry you were misled, I replied sincerely. That's between you and the developer, but I can't have people camping on my land, especially with my protection dogs returning. There he goes, making trouble again. Karen's voice cut through our conversation as she marched. Over. Don't let him intimidate you. He has no authority here. I have the only authority here, I countered, frustration mounting. This is my property. Karen turned to address the growing crowd. Everyone continue setting up camp. This is our community event and we have every right to be here. He's just making false claims to disrupt our weekend. As people hesitantly returned to their preparations, I checked my watch. 3:45 p.m. The kennel. Service would arrive with my dogs in just over an hour. I needed to resolve this quickly, or things could go from bad to dangerous very fast. The confrontation was escalating beyond a simple property dispute, with Karen seemingly determined to maintain her authority, regardless of the facts or potential consequences. My hope now rested with the sheriff, who would hopefully provide the official confirmation these trespassers needed. In the distance, I could see yet more cars turning onto my private road, bringing additional campers who had no idea they were walking into an increasingly volatile situation. The sight of Sheriff Martinez's patrol car coming up my driveway brought an immediate sense of relief. After 45 minutes of watching more campers arrive and set up, I was running out of both patience and time before my dog's return. Sheriff Martinez was a no-nonsense professional who had served the county for over 20 years. I'd met him previously during a property line dispute with a different neighbor, and he'd been fair but firm in enforcing property laws. Karen spotted the patrol car simultaneously and immediately changed her demeanor, replacing her confrontational stance with a welcoming smile. She hurried over before I could reach the sheriff. "Thank goodness you're here, Sheriff," she called out, extending her hand. "We're having our community wilderness weekend, and this man has been harassing our participants." Sheriff Martinez nodded politely, but non-committally as he stepped from his vehicle. "I received a call about potential trespassing. Let me sort this out. There's no trespassing issue," Karen insisted, producing her glossy brochure. "This is designated Community Wilderness Access for Oak Ridge Estates. See? It's right here in our official materials." The sheriff examined the brochure carefully, then turned to me. "Mr. Thornton, you're claiming this is your private property?" "Yes, sir. I've owned these 15 acres for 15 years. The developer never purchased any portion of my land or secured access rights. They simply included it in their marketing without permission. I have documentation in my patrol car," he nodded. The dispatcher pulled the property records when the call came in. Karen's confidence wavered slightly. Those records must be outdated. When Oak Ridge Estates was developed, this area was incorporated into our community plan. Sheriff Martinez retrieved a county map from his vehicle and spread it on the hood. According to current county records, this entire parcel is registered to Jack Thornton. The Oak Ridge Estates boundary ends here. He pointed to a line clearly showing the development stopping well short of where we stood. "But our trails, our community lake," Karen stammered, pointing to her brochure. "Marketing materials don't determine property ownership, ma'am. Legal deeds and county records do." The sheriff's tone remained professional but had hardened slightly. "It appears these people have been misled about access rights to this land." Karen's expression tightened. "There must be an easement or access agreement. The developer wouldn't have included these features without securing rights." "Do you have documentation of such an agreement?" Sheriff Martinez asked. Her silence was answer enough. The sheriff addressed the gathering crowd. "Folks, I need to inform you that you are currently on private property without the owner's permission. I understand you were misled by development materials, but legally, you need to pack up and leave." A murmur of distress spread through the campers. "But we paid for wilderness access," one man objected. "It was part of our home purchase." "Then your issue is with the developer, not Mr. Thornton," Sheriff Martinez explained. "He has the legal right to have his property cleared of trespassers." Rather than accepting this official determination, Karen seemed to grow more defiant. We have rights to recreational land. The developer promised us nature access, and we're going to have our community weekend as planned." The sheriff's expression remained calm but stern. "Ma'am, your marketing brochures don't override property law. This is private land." As the reality sank in for most campers, they began reluctantly packing up tents and equipment. Karen, however, moved through the crowd, urging them to stay. "Don't let them intimidate you. We have community rights to this wilderness area. The developer assured us this space was part of our amenities." "Ma'am," Sheriff Martinez called firmly, "you're encouraging people to commit criminal trespass. I suggest you stop immediately." I glanced at my watch. 4:30 p.m. The kennel service would arrive with my dogs in just 30 minutes. "Sheriff, there's another urgent issue," I explained. "My 4 guard dogs are being returned from boarding at 5 p.m. They're trained to protect this property, and having strangers scattered across the land when they arrive could be dangerous." This information clearly concerned the sheriff. "What breed of dogs?" "A Belgian Malinois, 2 German Shepherds, and a Cane Corso. They're professionally trained protection dogs." Sheriff Martinez immediately raised his voice to address the entire gathering. "Everyone needs to pack up immediately. This is now a safety issue as well as a legal one. Protection dogs will be on this property in 30 minutes. The mention of guard dogs accelerated many campers' departure, but Karen wasn't giving up. "He's obviously lying about the dogs to scare everyone away from our community land," she shouted, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. Sheriff Martinez reached for his radio. "I'm calling for additional units to help clear the property safely before the dogs arrive." As if on cue, a white van with Elite K9 services painted on the side appeared at the top of my driveway. "They're early," I said, a new urgency in my voice. The sheriff immediately moved toward the van, waving it to stop at a safe distance. Karen stared at the vehicle, the color draining from her face, as the reality of the situation finally seemed to sink in. The van's side door displayed silhouettes of 4 large dogs, with the text "Professional Protection Dogs" clearly visible. Her community wilderness weekend was about to face a security detail she hadn't anticipated. 4 highly trained canines, who took their job of protecting my property very seriously. Sheriff Martinez quickened his pace. "Everyone needs to leave now." The white Elite K9 services van parked at a safe distance as directed by Sheriff Martinez. Mike Reynolds, the company's owner and head trainer, stepped out looking understandably confused at the scene before him. Dozens of tents scattered across my property, people hurriedly packing camping gear, and a police presence that hadn't been expected when he'd agreed to drop off my dogs a bit early. "Jack!" Mike called, staying beside his van. "What's going on?" I jogged over to him, with Sheriff Martinez following close behind. "Unauthorized camping event," I explained quickly. "These people were told my land was a community recreation area. We're trying to get everyone out safely before the dogs are released." Mike nodded grimly, immediately understanding the potential issues. He'd trained my 4 dogs personally and knew exactly how they would respond to strangers spread across my property. "Good call keeping them contained," he said, glancing through the van's side window where my pack was visible, already alert and watching the unusual activity on their territory. Sheriff Martinez introduced himself and asked the question most relevant to the immediate situation: how quickly can these dogs be safely released once the property is clear? "They'll need to do a full property check with Jack first," Mike explained. "These aren't just pets. They're trained to detect and respond to intrusions. They'll need to verify the property is secure before settling in." From behind us came Karen's voice, now pitched with a note of anxiety I hadn't heard before. "Those are the guard dogs. They're enormous." She had approached close enough to peer into the van windows, where my security team waited. Zeus, the 90-pound Belgian Malinois, Rex and Athena, the German Shepherd siblings weighing 85 pounds each, and Magnus, the imposing 120-pound Cane Corso, whose black coat and serious expression tended to stop trespassers in their tracks. "They're standard sizes for their breeds," Mike replied professionally, "and they're exceptionally well-trained protection dogs, not aggressive pets. But they are specially conditioned to secure this property against intruders, which is why everyone needs to leave immediately." The sight of the actual dogs, rather than just the threat of their arrival, created a new urgency among the remaining campers. Families with children were particularly quick to accelerate their departure, casting nervous glances toward the van. Sheriff Martinez seized the moment to address the crowd. Everyone needs to vacate this private property now. These security. Dogs will be released once the area is clear, and they are trained to respond to unauthorized persons. Please gather your belongings and proceed to your vehicles in an orderly fashion. Karen, however, wasn't completely ready to surrender her authority. This is ridiculous. We can't just cancel our community event because he decided to bring dangerous animals onto public recreation land. Mike, who had remained professional until, now turned to Karen with the measured patience of someone who regularly dealt with misconceptions about working dogs. Ma'am, these are not dangerous animals. They're highly trained security dogs performing a specific function on private property. Jack has all the proper licenses and insurance for them. They undergo rigorous training and certification every 6 months to ensure they respond appropriately to threats while ignoring normal activities. He gestured toward the dogs in the van. They're currently calm, despite the unusual activity, because they're still in contained transport. Once released on property, they're trained to protect. They'll secure the perimeter and respond to anyone unauthorized as a potential threat, not aggressively, but with controlled containment behaviors. It would be irresponsible to release them, with civilians scattered across the land. The technical explanation from a clear professional seemed to finally penetrate Karen's defenses. She took a step back from the van, eyeing the dogs with new respect. Sheriff Martinez used the moment to press the advantage. Ma'am, continuing to encourage people to remain here is creating an unnecessary safety risk. These dogs are legally permitted on this private property. Your group is not. A second patrol car arrived, and the additional deputy began helping coordinate the increasingly steady stream of departing campers. Many seemed relieved to have an official reason to leave what had clearly become an uncomfortable situation. Worked with Sheriff Martinez to establish a clear exit route, directing people toward the main driveway while keeping them away from the areas where the dogs would first be released. Throughout this process, I noticed a distinct division forming among the campers. Some followed directions quickly and courteously, even apologizing for the intrusion once they understood the situation. Others, particularly those standing near Karen, moved with reluctant slowness, casting resentful glances my way. One man in his 40s approached me directly. "I'm Dale from the HOA board," he said quietly. "Just so you know, the board never actually approved this event. Karen organized it independently after the developer told her we couldn't use your land." This new information was enlightening, but not particularly surprising given Karen's behavior. Mike remained by the van, occasionally calming the dogs who were becoming increasingly alert to the unusual activity. Though still contained, their training was evident. They weren't barking wildly like excited pets, but watching with focused attention, awaiting commands. As the exodus continued, Karen found herself with a dwindling group of supporters. The physical presence of 4 large working dogs had accomplished what property deeds and sheriff's orders couldn't quite manage, a clear demonstration that this land was indeed actively protected private property, not an open community resource with. Approximately half the campers now departed, and the remainder packing up with varying degrees of urgency. The confrontation was evolving into a more complex social dynamic, revealing divisions within the Oak Ridge community itself about Karen's leadership and methods. As the exodus continued, a clear division emerged among the remaining campers. Young families and those with children were leaving most rapidly, casting nervous glances at the K9 van. Others packed methodically, embarrassed by the situation, but not particularly rushed. A core group of about 20 people, however, remained, clustered near Karen, their body language defiant despite the sheriff's directions. "We paid premium prices for homes with wilderness access," a woman in designer hiking gear complained loudly. "This is false advertising if we can't use this land." "I completely understand your frustration," I said, approaching the group. "But your issue is with the developer, who incorrectly included my private property in their marketing materials, not with me enforcing my legal property rights." Sheriff Martinez was helping coordinate departures, ensuring people could collect their belongings without further incident. "Folks, I understand you're disappointed, but continuing to delay is only creating a potentially dangerous situation. Karen seized on his comment. So you're admitting these dogs are dangerous? They shouldn't be allowed in a residential area. Mike Reynolds, still standing by the van containing my increasingly alert dogs, shook his head. Working protection dogs aren't dangerous when properly handled. They're trained to secure property against unauthorized entry, which is exactly what's happening here. They're a security system, not a threat to anyone who isn't trespassing. Dale, the HOA board member, who had earlier distanced himself from Karen's actions, began speaking with small groups of lingering campers. Though I couldn't hear everything he said, the effect was clear as more people accelerated their departure. After speaking with him, "The kids are getting scared," one father told Karen directly as he guided his family toward their car. "This isn't worth it, Karen. The HOA can sort this out with the developer later." "Don't let them intimidate you with these tactics," Karen responded. "If we leave, we're surrendering our community access rights." "Rights we apparently don't actually have," the man replied, continuing toward the parking area. I noticed a woman with 2 young children struggling to dismantle her tent alone. "Need a hand?" I offered, approaching carefully. She looked up with visible relief. "Yes, please. My husband was supposed to join us later." As I helped collapse the tent poles, she glanced toward Karen's group, then lowered her voice. "I'm sorry about this. We were told this was officially part of our community amenities. The sales office specifically highlighted these wilderness trails when we purchased. I've had issues with people on the trails before, but nothing like this organized camping event," I explained. "I'm not opposed to reasonable discussions about limited, controlled access, but this surprise invasion with over 100 people is completely unacceptable." "I understand," she nodded. "I wouldn't want strangers camping in my backyard either." As we finished packing her gear, her young son looked toward the K9 van with undisguised interest. "Are those police dogs?" "Not police dogs, but they have similar training," I explained. "They help protect my property when I'm not here." "Cool!" the boy exclaimed, his fear apparently replaced by fascination. This interaction seemed to reassure several watching families that I wasn't the unreasonable ogre Karen had portrayed. 3 more groups immediately approached, asking for clear directions on the safest exit route. I established a path along my main driveway, well away from where the dogs would eventually patrol, and helped several people carry heavier items to their vehicles. Each positive interaction seemed to sway more campers toward departure. Dale approached with a small group of Oak Ridge residents. "I've been explaining that the HOA board never approved this event," he told me. "Karen organized this independently, after being explicitly told by our attorney that we couldn't use this land without owner permission." This public acknowledgement from an HOA board member created a visible shift in the dynamics. Several people who had been hesitating immediately began packing, no longer feeling obligated to support what was apparently an unauthorized event even within their own community structure. Karen, watching her support erode, attempted to rally her remaining loyalists. "They're trying to divide us. The developer assured me this wilderness access was part of our community plan." "Then the developer lied to you," Dale stated flatly, "and you should be addressing this with them, not trespassing on private property and putting our community at legal risk." The confrontation between Karen and Dale, essentially a civil war within the HOA leadership, drew everyone's attention, providing Sheriff Martinez an opportunity to approach the K9 van and speak with Mike about a timeline for safely releasing my dogs. I joined their conversation. "How soon can we begin property securing procedures?" "Once the main area is clear, we can start with Zeus on the perimeter check," Mike explained. "He's the most focused on boundary work. We'd keep the others secured until the all clear." Sheriff Martinez nodded. "We should have everyone out within 30 minutes at this rate." As if to contradict his optimism, Karen's voice rose in pitch. "I'm calling our attorney. This is a violation of our community rights." "We have no community rights here, Karen," Dale responded, his patience clearly thinning. "This is privately owned land that was falsely represented in marketing materials. You're creating liability for every homeowner in Oak Ridge by continuing this standoff." This statement caught the attention of several remaining campers, who exchanged concerned glances. The potential for personal liability apparently hadn't occurred to them until now. Could we actually be sued for this? Someone asked Dale. Absolutely, he confirmed. Trespassing, property damage, and ignoring law enforcement directives all create potential liability for individuals, not just the HOA. This practical concern accomplished what appeals to property rights hadn't quite managed. Within minutes, half of Karen's remaining supporters were packing up, leaving her with only about 10 people, mostly those who appeared to be personal friends rather than simply Oak Ridge residents. As the crowd thinned further, the dynamics of the situation shifted from a community conflict toward a small group of individuals knowingly refusing to leave private property despite clear legal direction. Sheriff Martinez approached this final group directly. At this point, anyone remaining after the next 15 minutes will be formally charged with criminal trespassing. I've been patient because I understand you were misled, but that patience is reaching its limit. The line in the sand had been drawn, forcing everyone to choose sides in a conflict that had revealed much deeper divisions within the Oak Ridge community than a simple property dispute, exposing fault lines between those who respected legal boundaries and those who followed Karen's lead regardless of the facts. As the remaining campers packed up their gear, several lingered to chat with me away from Karen's influence. Their conversations revealed pieces of a larger puzzle I'd been trying to understand since finding my property invaded. The wilderness access was the main reason we bought in Oak Ridge, explained a woman named Susan as she loaded a cooler into her SUV. The sales office had this beautiful display showing nature trails, fishing at the community lake, and pristine forest, all just steps from our backyards. It was a major selling point, her husband added. They charged an extra $30,000 for wilderness view lots that supposedly bordered this nature preserve. Another homeowner approached, introducing himself as Mark. The brochures specifically mentioned 15 acres of protected woodland for exclusive resident use. When I asked about ownership, the sales agent said it was secured community land. They never explicitly said they owned it, Susan noted. Looking back, their wording was carefully chosen. They said things like community access and reserved for residents without actually claiming ownership. Sheriff Martinez, overhearing this conversation, shook his head. That sounds like deliberate misrepresentation. You folks might have grounds for action against the developer. Dale joined our growing circle, adding crucial context. Oak Ridge originally planned to purchase this parcel. I've seen the early development proposals. But when Mr. Thornton refused to sell, they should have removed it from the amenities list. Instead, they kept marketing it as if the purchase had gone through. They never even made me an offer, I clarified, surprised by this information. They approached your neighbor by mistake, Dale explained. The elderly gentleman on the north side, they thought he owned this parcel. By the time they realized their error, pre-sales had already begun with the wilderness amenities as a key feature. This explained so much about the confusion, though not the sheer audacity of proceeding with false marketing. As we talked, Mike was preparing Zeus, my Belgian Malinois, for a preliminary property check of the areas now clear of campers. The dog's focused alertness was evident, not aggressive but intensely attentive to his handler and surroundings. Have you always had protection dogs? Mark asked, watching Zeus with respectful interest. I got them after a series of break-ins. 3 years ago, I explained. This property is remote enough that standard security systems weren't sufficient. Someone broke into my workshop twice and took thousands of dollars worth of equipment. The dogs were recommended by the sheriff's department, I continued. They're specifically trained to secure the property when I'm away. They'll protect the boundaries but won't pursue beyond the property line. Mark nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense for an isolated property like this. I had no idea we were trespassing on secured private land. The developer created these trails and put up little markers with the Oak Ridge logo. We thought it was officially part of our community. I've been finding new trails cut through my woods for months, I acknowledged, and occasional hikers. Posted private property signs, but they kept disappearing. Dale looked embarrassed. That would be Karen. She's been organizing community nature hikes on your property for at least 6 months. When someone mentioned seeing no trespassing signs, she told everyone they were mistakenly placed and had them removed. So this Camping event wasn't her first unauthorized use of my land, I noted, pieces falling into place. Not by a long shot, Dale confirmed. She's been doing this systematically, establishing regular use patterns. Our HOA attorney warned her about potential adverse possession claims, but she insisted the land was part of our community package. Sheriff Martinez, who had been listening quietly, interjected. That explains why we've had multiple trespassing calls in this area over the past year. I'm guessing you made some of those, Mr. Thornton? I nodded. Several times. Usually the trespassers would be gone by the time anyone responded. Karen would alert everyone through the community app whenever. Law enforcement was spotted, Dale admitted. She called it wildlife warnings, but it was clearly to avoid confrontation with authorities. As we spoke, Mike and Zeus had completed their initial perimeter check of the now empty camping area. The other 3 dogs remained secured in the van, watching attentively through the windows. So Karen knew this was private property all along, I summarized, the extent of the deliberate trespassing campaign becoming clear. Almost certainly, Dale confirmed. The HOA board received a cease and desist letter from the developer's attorney 3 months ago, specifically warning about unauthorized use of adjacent private property. Karen dismissed it as overly cautious legal language and continued organizing activities here anyway. Why didn't other board members stop her? Sheriff Martinez asked. She controlled information flow, Dale explained. Most communications went through her first. When questions arose, she'd insist everything was properly authorized. Most of us only learned the truth when this camping event was announced, and we requested documentation. This revelation of systematic deception explained why so many Oak Ridge residents genuinely believed they had rights to use my land. They'd been deliberately misled by both their developers' marketing and their HOA president's actions. The final group of campers was now departing, leaving only Karen and her 5 most loyal supporters still packing their extensive setup near my pond. Their body language communicated clear resentment, with occasional glares thrown in my direction. As Mike prepared to bring out the second dog for property securing, I reflected on how this conflict had emerged from layers of misrepresentation, from developer marketing materials to Karen's calculated campaign to establish de facto use rights to my land. What had initially seemed like a simple case of trespassing had revealed itself as something far more deliberate, a systematic attempt to create the impression of public access where none legally existed, all to justify real estate premiums and fulfill promises made to homebuyers without securing the actual rights to deliver on those promises. The setting sun cast long shadows across my property as the situation entered a new phase of urgency. With the majority of campers gone, and Zeus already patrolling the cleared perimeter, the remaining issues centered on Karen and her 5 loyal supporters, who continued their deliberately slow packing near the pond. Sheriff Martinez approached their group directly. Folks, I need to establish a clear deadline. For safety reasons, everyone must be off this property before darkness falls completely. We've paid for our campsite, Karen responded, referring to a fee she'd apparently collected from participants. We're entitled to the full weekend we were promised. You collected money for access to property you don't own? The sheriff's tone sharpened. That potentially escalates this from simple trespassing to fraud. This comment visibly unsettled Karen's remaining supporters, who exchanged concerned glances. The funds were for event organization, not property access, Karen quickly clarified, and we have every right to be here based on our community amenities package. Your marketing materials don't override private property rights, Sheriff Martinez stated firmly. Everyone needs to be packed and gone within the next 30 minutes before visibility becomes a safety issue. I surveyed the extensive equipment still scattered around their campsite. Large tents, cooking stoves, coolers, and what appeared to be sound equipment for some planned entertainment. The amount of gear suggested they had indeed been planning a substantial weekend event. Fire hazard, Mike commented quietly beside me, nodding toward the cooking equipment. Those camp stoves could be dangerous so close to your timber stand, especially with amateurs. He was right. My property included several acres of harvestable timber that represented both environmental value and financial investment. A forest, fire would be devastating. "Sheriff," I called, "there's significant fire risk associated with that cooking equipment. My property includes valuable timber that could be at risk if they're using those stoves improperly." Martinez nodded grimly. "Another valid concern." He turned to address Karen's group. "No fires or cooking equipment is to be activated. Pack it all up immediately." As the standoff continued, Dale approached with news that shifted the dynamic once again. "I've been making some calls," he told me quietly. "Karen doesn't actually live in Oak Ridge Estates. She works for Prestige Marketing, the firm handling sales and promotion for the development. She's not even a resident or legitimate HOA member. She's been presenting herself as the HOA president," I noted, surprised by this revelation. "She holds that title through a technicality," Dale explained. "During the initial development phase, the builder establishes a preliminary HOA, board with their own people before turning it over to actual homeowners. That transition was supposed to happen 3 months ago, but Karen kept delaying the handover elections. This new information explained her desperate defense of access to my property. Her job likely depended on delivering the promised amenities that had been used to sell homes at premium prices. As darkness approached, Mike decided it was time to bring out Rex, one of the German shepherds, to continue securing the property's perimeter. The controlled, professional manner in which he handled the dog was impressive. Rex remained focused and responsive, despite the unusual circumstances. The presence of a second working dog created newfound urgency among Karen's remaining supporters. One man approached her with visible concern. "Karen, this isn't worth it. They have legal authority and trained security dogs. We should leave and address this through proper channels." "If we leave now, we're surrendering our access rights," she insisted. "We need to maintain our presence to establish community use." "That's not how property law works," Sheriff Martinez interjected, overhearing this exchange. "Continuing to trespass after being informed of property rights only compounds the legal violation." The arrival of 3 additional HOA board members further shifted the dynamics. They had clearly come to officially distance the Oak Ridge community from Karen's actions. The board has called an emergency meeting and voted to formally repudiate this event, announced an older gentleman who introduced himself as the HOA vice president. "We're issuing an immediate community notification that this was not an authorized HOA activity." Karen's face flushed with anger. "You can't do that. I'm the president. Your position is with the developer's marketing team, not as a resident homeowner," he responded firmly. "The board has voted to accelerate the transition to resident control effective immediately, as per our bylaws." This public undermining of her authority seemed to finally break through Karen's determination. As her remaining supporters absorbed this new information, they began packing with genuine urgency, rather than reluctant compliance. "You work for the developer?" one woman asked Karen directly. "You told us you lived on Oak Ridge Circle." "I represent the community interests," Karen replied defensively, but her position was clearly crumbling. As twilight deepened, Sheriff Martinez established a firm deadline. "Anyone remaining on this property after dark will be arrested for criminal trespassing. This is your final warning." The combination of imminent darkness, active security dogs, and the revelation of Karen's true role finally accomplished what hours of discussion couldn't. Within 20 minutes, the last of the equipment was being loaded into vehicles. Karen, now isolated as even her loyal supporters prepared to leave, made a final attempt to assert authority. "The developer will address this access issue. We'll be back with proper documentation of our community rights." "I'll be here," I replied calmly, "along with my property deed, boundary markers, and security team." As headlights illuminated the big, growing darkness, the last vehicles departed down my driveway. Leaving Sheriff Martinez to verify the property was completely clear before Mike could begin the final phase of releasing and orienting all 4 dogs to secure the premises. The immediate crisis was resolving, but the larger conflict between development promises and private property rights remained unresolved. As night fell over my once again quiet land, I knew this confrontation had exposed issues that would require more than just enforcement of trespassing laws to fully address. Dawn broke over my property, with a stillness that felt earned after the previous day's chaos. Sheriff Martinez had remained until the last trespassers departed, and Mike had successfully reoriented all 4 dogs to secure the premises overnight. Though exhausted, I'd slept soundly knowing my property was once again under proper protection. Was enjoying my first cup of coffee on the porch, watching Zeus patrol the perimeter with focused attention, when a familiar SUV appeared at my gate. Karen had returned alone this time, and was speaking into her phone while gesturing emphatically toward my property. Sheriff Martinez had advised me to document any further incidents, so I immediately activated my phone's camera and began recording as she exited her vehicle and approached my gate. The dogs, detecting the visitor, moved into their trained positions, visible but controlled, watchful but not aggressive. "You need to call off these animals immediately," Karen demanded as I approached the gate, maintaining a safe distance. "I have authorization to access this land." "What authorization would that be?" I asked calmly, continuing to record. She held up her phone, displaying what appeared to be an email, direct from Oak Ridge Development Corporation. This land was included in our community plan and approved by the County Planning Commission. Planning approval for a development doesn't transfer ownership of adjacent properties, I pointed out. Do you have a deed? A sales contract? Any legal document showing transfer of ownership from me to the developer? Karen's expression flickered with frustration. The developer has established usage rights through prior community access. This property has been part of Oak Ridge's amenities package for over a year. Trespassing doesn't create legal rights, regardless of how long it occurs, I explained, keeping my tone measured, despite her increasingly agitated state. The dogs had maintained their positions, alert but disciplined. Karen glanced nervously at them before returning to her argument. "Your property is preventing an entire community from enjoying the nature access they paid premium prices for," she insisted.
Yes.
"Do you have any idea how much those homes cost? People invested their life savings based on the amenities package. I sympathize with homebuyers who were misled," I responded sincerely. "But that's an issue between them and the developer who paid false promises. My property rights aren't nullified by someone else's misrepresentation." Karen changed tactics. "We're prepared to offer fair compensation for an access easement. The Development Corporation is willing to pay for the trails and lake usage." This was the first reasonable approach she'd taken, though her tone suggested it was a reluctant concession rather than a genuine offer. "I'd be willing to discuss limited structured access options with the actual homeowners association," I acknowledged, "but not under these conditions, and certainly not after yesterday's invasion." Karen seemed momentarily encouraged by this partial opening. "So you admit there's room for negotiation about community access?" I said I'd be willing to discuss options with legitimate representatives of the homeowners, which you are not. Any discussions would need to happen through proper legal channels with clear boundaries and formal agreements. Her temporary composure crumbled. "I am the authorized representative. This entire community relies on me to secure their promised amenities." As if on cue, 2 vehicles pulled up behind Karen's SUV. From one emerged Dale and the HOA vice president. From the other, a man in a business suit I didn't recognize. "Karen, this ends now," the suited man called as he approached. "You're making this situation worse and creating significant liability for the company." She whirled to face him. "James, finally. Tell them about our usage rights to this wilderness area." The man, apparently a developer representative, looked uncomfortable. "There are no established usage rights, Karen. As I've explained repeatedly, we never completed the purchase of this parcel. The marketing materials should have been updated, but that doesn't change the legal reality." Karen's expression registered genuine shock. "But you told me to proceed with the community nature programs. You approved the hiking trail markers." "I authorized programs on property we actually owned," James clarified firmly, "not on private land that was never successfully acquired." This public repudiation by her employer seemed to finally penetrate Karen's determined facade. For a moment she stood speechless, looking between James and me as the full implications became clear. "You're terminated, effective immediately," James continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your personal crusade has created enormous liability for the company. The legal department is already preparing statements distancing us from your unauthorized actions. As Karen struggled to process this development, Dale stepped forward with a document in hand. The HOA board has also drafted a formal disavowal of your actions, he stated. We've accelerated the transition to resident control, and the interim board has voted unanimously to retract any claims to Mr. Thornton's property. Karen's carefully constructed authority was collapsing from all sides simultaneously. Her employer had fired her, the HOA had removed her from power, and her claims to my property had been publicly refuted by both entities. Rather than accept defeat, however, she made one final, desperate stand. "This is my project," she shouted, her composure completely evaporating. "I built this community. I promised these amenities. Without me, Oak Ridge Estates would be nothing but overpriced houses in the middle of nowhere." In a sudden movement that startled everyone, Karen turned and strode directly toward my gate, apparently intending to force her way onto the property despite everything. The dogs immediately responded to the aggressive approach, not attacking but moving into more alert defensive positions, their training evident in their controlled response. "Karen, stop!" Several voices called simultaneously. She froze just short of the gate, finally registering the serious consequences her actions might trigger. The dogs hadn't barked or lunged, their training was too good for such undisciplined reactions, but their focused attention and positioned stance made it clear they were prepared to prevent unauthorized entry. James approached carefully. "Karen, you need to leave now. You're making a scene and potentially creating a dangerous situation." "This isn't over," she declared, though her voice had lost its commanding tone. "I have adverse possession rights through established community use. I've documented over a year of regular access." "Trespassing doesn't convert to ownership rights," Dale pointed out, "especially when the owner has actively posted against it and reported it to authorities." As Karen stood paralyzed by indecision, a patrol car pulled up, Sheriff Martinez arriving for a scheduled follow-up check after yesterday's incident. His timing couldn't have been better. Assessing the situation immediately, he approached with professional calm. "Ms. Davidson, I advised you yesterday about trespassing on this property. Are we having the same issue today?" "She was just leaving," James said firmly, taking Karen's arm to guide her back toward the vehicles. For a moment, it seemed she might resist, but the combined authority of her former employer, the HOA leadership, the sheriff, and not least, my attentive security dogs, finally overwhelmed her determination. As she allowed herself to be led back to her SUV, she turned for one final declaration. "This community deserves the amenities they were promised. Someone has to fight for their rights. We'll address our amenities package legally and ethically," Dale responded, "not through trespassing and misrepresentation." I watched as Karen's SUV disappeared down the road, followed by James from the development company. Dale and the HOA vice president remained, clearly wanting to continue a more productive conversation about resolving the situation appropriately. Sheriff Martinez summed it up succinctly as he joined me at the gate. "Some people just can't accept when they're wrong, even with overwhelming evidence and authority telling them so." The dogs, sensing the threat had passed, relaxed their alert stance but maintained their watchful patrol of the property boundaries, a visible reminder of why my land had remained secure despite Karen's determined campaign to claim it for her. Community amenities package. Her last stand had failed not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple, inexorable weight of legal reality finally catching up to her carefully constructed fiction. The Sunday morning after Karen's final, confrontation dawned clear and quiet. I took my coffee outside to survey what remained of the community wilderness weekend that had so abruptly ended. Despite Sheriff Martinez's efforts to ensure campers removed their belongings, evidence of the invasion remained scattered across my property. Trampled vegetation marked where tents had stood. Half-buried fire pits dotted the meadow near my pond. Discarded trash, wrappers, water bottles, and forgotten camping gear littered the area. The most concerning discovery was several improperly extinguished campfires that could have easily sparked a wildfire had they not been doused by my thorough property inspection with the dogs. I was photographing the damage for insurance purposes when vehicles appeared at my gate. Rather than Karen returning, I was surprised to see Dale and several Oak Ridge residents, many of whom had been present during yesterday's confrontation. "We've come to help clean up," Dale explained as I approached. "It's the least we can do after." "What happened?" The group had brought trucks, trash bags, rakes, and other cleanup supplies. Among them were families who had participated in the camping event, but left willingly once they understood the situation. "We feel terrible about trespassing." "On your land," one woman explained as I showed them where most of the damage was concentrated. "We genuinely believed this was community property." Throughout the morning, more Oak Ridge residents arrived to assist, ultimately forming a substantial volunteer crew. While they worked, I learned more about how thoroughly they had been misled. "The sales office had a beautiful diorama of the community," one man explained while filling a trash bag. "It showed your pond labeled as Oak Ridge Lake, with a community dock and fishing platforms. When I asked specifically about ownership, they said everything in the model was part of our community amenities." Karen organized regular activities. "Here," another added, "nature walks, bird-watching groups, even a summer camp for kids last year. We never questioned whether it was authorized because it was all officially scheduled through the HOA." By midday, the combined effort had largely restored my property. Fire pits were properly extinguished and filled, trash collected, and damaged areas marked for revegetation. The community's response to the situation revealed a genuine desire to make amends. Dale pulled me aside as the work was winding down. "The HOA board met early this morning. We want to discuss establishing proper relations moving forward," he explained. That the board had drafted a formal apology, acknowledging the trespassing and property misrepresentation. More significantly, they had contacted their attorney about potential legal action against the developer for falsely marketing my property as community amenities. "We've also launched an internal investigation into HOA funds Karen controlled," Dale added. "Preliminary review suggests she used association money to mark trails on your land, create unauthorized access points, and even pay for portions of this weekend's event." The developer was also moving quickly to address the situation. By afternoon, James returned with the company's legal counsel to discuss potential resolutions. "We're preparing corrected marketing materials to remove any reference to your property," James explained. "And we'll be offering compensation options to homeowners who purchased based on those misrepresentations." I listened to these developments with cautious optimism while continuing to evaluate the damage to my property. While most of the physical evidence of the camping invasion had been cleaned up, the unauthorized trails cut through my woods represented a more significant issue. These would require professional restoration to prevent erosion and protect the natural ecosystem. "We'll cover those restoration costs," James offered when I pointed this out. "It's clearly our responsibility, given the circumstances." The most meaningful conversation came late in the day when Dale and several homeowners approached me with a thoughtful proposal. "We understand this is your private property, and what happened was completely unacceptable," Dale began. "But many families in our community genuinely value connecting with nature. Would you be open to discussing a limited, structured access agreement, something formal, with proper boundaries and respect for your property rights?" Unlike Karen's demands, this request came with appropriate recognition of my ownership and authority. I agreed to consider options that might allow controlled access to specific areas through a formal easement agreement with proper compensation and liability coverage. "I'm not opposed to sharing nature experiences," I explained. "I just need it to happen on my terms, with proper respect for boundaries and my security concerns." As the volunteers departed, the atmosphere had transformed from conflict to cautious cooperation. Sheriff Martinez arrived for a final check, pleased to see the successful community cleanup effort. "Any word on Karen?" I asked him. "She's been served with a trespassing warning. The developer is distancing themselves completely, claiming she acted without authorization. The district attorney is reviewing whether the organized nature of this incursion and the collection of fees warrants additional charges." The sheriff surveyed the now restored property. "Your dogs seem more relaxed today. Indeed, my security team had adjusted to the increased human activity, maintaining their vigilant perimeter checks, but showing no aggression toward the volunteers working under my supervision." As evening approached and the last vehicles departed, I walked my property, boundaries with Zeus beside me. The physical invasion had been addressed, but the larger questions about suburban development pressures on rural land remained. The proper delineation of boundaries, both physical and legal, would require ongoing attention. The aftermath of Karen's failed wilderness weekend had revealed both the worst and best of community dynamics. The entitlement that had led to the invasion, but also the responsibility and respect shown in addressing its consequences. 6 months after the Great Camping Invasion, as locals now jokingly called it, significant changes had transformed both my property and its relationship with the neighboring development. The most visible change appeared along the boundary between my land and Oak Ridge Estates, a professional landscape buffer with clearly marked property lines and educational signage. Private property boundary, wildlife conservation area read, the tasteful markers placed every 100 feet. Smaller signs provided information about local ecosystems and wildlife, turning the boundary into an educational feature rather than just a barrier. The developer had funded the entire project as part of their settlement agreement with me. The restoration of unauthorized trails had been completed professionally, with damaged areas replanted with native species. Rather than simply erasing all human impact, we had worked with a conservation specialist to establish one properly designed trail with controlled access points and clear limitations. This compromise represented the most meaningful evolution, a formal legal access agreement between myself and the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Unlike Karen's demanded community access, this arrangement included specific terms. Limited. Access to a single well-maintained nature trail during daylight hours only. Advance notice via a resident text system when my security dogs were actively patrolling. Liability insurance coverage provided by the HOA. An annual contribution to property maintenance and conservation efforts. Clear acknowledgement of private ownership and usage restrictions. The HOA had installed a digital system where residents could register before using the trail, allowing me to know exactly who was on my property at any time. Air-coded gate provided secure access that could be monitored and, if necessary, restricted. Dale, now serving as the officially elected HOA president, had been instrumental in creating this balanced approach. Under his leadership, the homeowners had taken a realistic view of amenities and property boundaries, focusing on what could be legally and ethically provided rather than marketing fantasies. The residents actually prefer this arrangement, Dale mentioned during one of our now regular boundary walks. They know exactly what access they have without the uncertainty of Karen's unauthorized activities. The developer had faced significant consequences for their misleading marketing. In addition to funding boundary improvements and trail restoration on my property, they had been required to provide alternative amenities within the development itself. A community park, nature center, and expanded hiking trails on land they actually owned. Perhaps most satisfyingly, they had issued formal correction letters to all homeowners, explicitly acknowledging that my property had been incorrectly represented in their materials. This admission of wrongdoing had opened the door for several homeowners to negotiate compensation for the misrepresented amenities that had influenced their purchase decisions. Karen herself had faced both professional and legal consequences. After her termination from the marketing company, she had been charged with organizational trespassing and misrepresentation. Rather than jail time, her sentence included community service hours specifically focused on property rights education and conservation projects, a fitting justice that several observers noted contained perfect irony. My relationship with the dogs had deepened through the experience. What had begun as a security measure had evolved into a profound partnership. Zeus, Rex, Athena, and Magnus continued their protective duties, but they'd also been integrated into the new reality of limited, controlled public access. The local K9 training center even featured them in a community education day about working dogs, using our experience to highlight the distinction between aggressive pets and professionally trained security animals. The text alert system had proven particularly effective. Residents planning to use the trail would receive notifications like, Security dogs patrolling north section this morning from 9:11 a.m. South Trail remains open. This reasonable accommodation allowed my security needs and controlled public access to coexist without conflict. Most meaningfully, the boundary itself had been transformed from a source of conflict to a point of cooperation. What Karen had tried to erase through denial and trespassing had instead been clearly marked, respected, and in a limited way shared through proper agreement rather than invasion. One cool autumn evening, I walked the property line with Zeus beside me. On the other side of the boundary, several Oak Ridge families were enjoying a sunset nature walk on the designated trail. They waved respectfully as I passed, keeping to the path and pointing out the educational signs to their children. Some boundaries are meant to be crossed, and others are meant to be respected, I overheard one father explaining to his curious daughter, who had asked about the property line markers. This is a special arrangement where Mr. Thornton shares his land with us because we respect his ownership. I couldn't have explained it better myself. This balanced approach had created something more valuable than either extreme position, not Karen's boundary-free community access, nor complete isolation of my property, but a thoughtful middle ground, where clear boundaries actually enabled meaningful connection. Later that week, I received an email from Dale with a surprising update. The HOA had unanimously voted to name the official trail Boundary Bridge Path, acknowledging both the physical property line it crossed and the community bridge it had ultimately built. As Zeus and I completed our evening patrol, a family with young children was leaving the trail before sunset, exactly as the agreement specified. They closed the access gate carefully behind them, the children waving to Zeus, who had learned which visitors were authorized and which represented security concerns. "Thank you for sharing your beautiful land," the mother called. I nodded in acknowledgement, appreciating the simple respect embodied in her words. Karen had failed to understand what these residents instinctively recognized, that proper boundaries, clearly defined and mutually respected, don't divide communities. They make good neighbors possible.